What is a lease purchase? How does it work? What are its pros and cons? Stay tuned, and in this video, I'll answer those questions and more. Now, before we begin, I need to define a couple of terms. First is a land contract, sometimes called a contract for deed, or maybe an agreement for deed. Now, what a land contract is a contract between a buyer and a seller for real property. And the seller provides the buyer financing for the purchase, and the buyer repays the resulting loan in installments. No, this is not seller financing. It sounds a lot like it, but here's the big difference between a land contract and seller financing. In a land contract, the seller retains the legal title to the property. That's the deed. The buyer gets to take possession of it and use the property. They basically get all of the bundle of rights, but they don't get legal title. So that's a land contract. What the buyer does get is what we call equitable interest. So they have a financial interest in the property, but title hasn't yet transferred. And we're going to find out here in a little bit that makes a big difference. So who uses land contracts? Land contracts are often used by buyers that can't get traditional mortgage, maybe because of poor credit, don't have the cash, or any of a myriad of reasons. Sellers can use them because they have a property that they're unable to find a buyer for who can qualify for traditional lending. And there's some benefits. If you combine that with a traditional lease, now you have a lease purchase agreement. The seller not only gets the lease payments, but they can also they know they've got that buyer, and they're also getting an inflated more cash flow. That can often be seen as a good thing. Again, buyers get to have interest in a property they don't own. They don't necessarily have to maintain, don't have to pay the taxes or insurance directly. But they're still building up equity because the purchase price has already been set. Sounds like a great thing, right? And lease purchases can be a good thing until they're not. Now, some of the drawbacks to a lease purchase is anytime that there's financing involved, somebody somewhere's got to worry about what happens if they don't pay. In this case, it's a double-edged sword. The tenant/buyer's got to worry about what happens if the seller landlord doesn't pay the mortgage. After all, they're getting the seller landlord's giving the buyer tenant money. What are they doing with it? Heaven forbid that the seller landlord doesn't pay their mortgage, and all of a sudden that property gets foreclosed on. What happens to all that equity that the buyer tenant built up over the time period? Well, the good news is we have lawyers and courts for that, right? On the other side, the seller landlord has to worry about what happens if the tenant doesn't pay. The tenant is more than a tenant. Remember, they have equitable interest. They have put money toward it. They have equity in the property. So now they could very well find themselves having to go through a very costly and lengthy foreclosure process as opposed to a simple tenant eviction. Again, it's what lawyers and courts are for, right? It's a win-win all the way around, especially for the courts and the lawyers. As you might have been able to guess, I'm not a big fan of lease purchase agreements because if things go wrong, they tend to go horribly wrong. There's a lot of simpler ways, much cleaner ways to accomplish pretty much the same thing. However, I'm not going to say that they're all bad. Just there could be situations out there where it makes sense. But if that's something that you're considering, either as a tenant buyer or a landlord/seller, make sure you consult with a really good real estate attorney and think about all the things that can go wrong and how you're going to protect yourself. Would you like to learn more about real estate investing? We host a Zoom meeting and training session every Thursday evening and Saturdays. Reach out to me at the numbers above for an invitation. I'll be happy to get you in.